All right, it is my extreme pleasure to have back on Bad Faith podcast Craig Mokhiber. You know him as the former UN human rights official and specialist who stepped down from his position a few weeks after October 7th, in late October of 2023. He stepped down as the director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome back to Bad Faith podcast.
So good to be back with you, Brianna. Thank you.
I should ask you how long you've been back stateside, because, of course, you just came back from this Sarajevo tribunal where you set forth a really powerful statement of condemnation of the behaviors, actions of Israel since October 7th. Tell us a little bit about what motivated this Sarajevo statement and the kind of 4-day conference to be put together in the first place.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of your viewers will be familiar with the Russell Tribunal, the history of the Russell Tribunal. It's like 60 years ago, as the world was horrified by what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam, its acts of aggression, serial atrocities against the people of Vietnam. And as they were witnessing the absolute impunity that was being afforded to the U.S. while it was committing those crimes, a lot of people were extremely frustrated, as witnessed by the anti-war demonstrations of those days, because no states, no group of states, no international institutions seemed to be doing anything to end the horrors that were being perpetrated in Vietnam. And that, sent a very strong message to people in civil society who cared that, freedom was not going to come from the outside. It would only come from popular resistance inside of Vietnam and global solidarity outside. And in that context, you had Bertrand Russell, the prominent British philosopher, public intellectual, who launched the first People's Tribunal. That was an organized expression of moral outrage by some of the very prominent thinkers at the time. And he got up in front of this new tribunal and he said, okay, we're a tribunal, but we are not judges. We are witnesses. And our task is to make mankind bear witness to these terrible crimes and to unite humanity on the side of justice. That's where these people tribunals come from. And now another people's tribunal is following in the footsteps of that, this time to confront the Israeli regime's genocide in Palestine, the racist ideology that underpins it, and of course the complicit Western powers like the US and corporations that enable it. So in November of 2024, and then meeting for the first time in London in February of 2025, the Gaza Tribunal came together. And it just completed its first public meeting and public hearings in Sarajevo from 26 to 29 May, with the adoption of the declaration to which you referred, the Declaration of Sarajevo. This was an initiative of another prominent public intellectual, this time Professor Richard Falk. He's a preeminent professor of international law, former special rapporteur on human rights in Palestine. He's now the president of the Gaza Tribunal, which assembles thinkers and activists from Palestine, from around the globe, not only to challenge, the genocide that's being perpetrated, but also the complicity of states and media corporations and others, especially in the West, and the inaction or inadequate response of international institutions to this. So we work through, I'm a member of the Tribunal. I serve on its steering committee, and I'm also co-chair of one of its so-called chambers on international relations and world order. We look at international law, international institutions, history, ethics, philosophy, all of the failures that have allowed this to go forward, to talk about how we can use the power of people to try to push back against these horrors. And we listen to survivor testimonies, expert witnesses, analysis of our own members. We'll be convening a jury of conscience in the coming months to pronounce on this question as well. We're putting together an archive of evidence, and we adopted this Declaration of Sarajevo on 29 May to encapsulate basically our vision for a global moral response to the ongoing Nakba in Palestine.
Can you elaborate a little bit about what you heard in the testimonies that took place over the course of the 4 days in Sarajevo?
Well, there's a remarkable consensus amongst activists, academics, thinkers, public intellectuals, philosophers, lawyers, which is a kind of universal moral outrage at a live streamed genocide, of which we are all aware by now, 19 months into this horror, but not just this current upsurge in genocide, but 77 years plus of colonization and persecution of the Palestinian people, and a frustration with genocide denial, ignoring the colonization and persecution of the Palestinian people amongst official institutions at the national level, at the international level, media corporations, complicit other actors in society, and a sense that this is a real threat, not just to the lives and well-being of the Palestinian people on the front lines of this struggle, but to the whole idea of an international order, the whole idea of international law, of international human rights, of international cooperation, international relations understood as having some normative base. All of these things are being threatened in an existential battle, the front lines of which are in Palestine at the moment. And we reject basically, the common wisdom of officialdom. We begin with this basic idea that Palestinian people are human beings with human rights, right? They have the right to self-determination. They have the right to return to their homes anywhere in historic Palestine. They have the right to be equal under the law, freedom from fear and want. This is a basic statement of what international law says, but what is denied by the powers that be in this cases. And also, you heard, a very strong recognition that there is an alignment of quite dark forces that are perpetrating that genocide in Palestine and threatening all of these very important aspects of the societies in which we live, and seeing the failure of international institutions to do their job as well. So, a universal recognition that the cause of justice falls to people, to legitimate resistance, to acts of solidarity, to civil disobedience, to civil society and social movements, to people of conscience, basically everywhere. And at least an idea that we have to try to mobilize the power of the people in their millions to challenge Israel's crimes and its co-conspirators, conspirators, to isolate the Israeli regime, to dissent to the complicity of our own governments and our own institutions in the genocide, to bring pressure to bear from society, right? That people refer to it as bottom up. I actually think it's top down. I don't put the politicians above society, but to bring pressure in every sector to make clear that genocide will not be normalized, apartheid will not be normalized, colonialism will not be normalized anymore, and yes, Palestine will be free. That's the cry of conscience that was coming out of the tribunal. We heard not just the testimony of experts and thinkers, but also moving testimony from victims of horrific forms of torture and abuse and deprivation and starvation that was read at the meeting of the tribunal as well. And the way I want to avoid any confusion. So the tribunal, includes some of the most skilled international lawyers on the planet. That's for sure. But it's not a formal legal or judicial mechanism. It's an assembly of civil society, of movements, of thinkers and activists that is just people who are determined to end these horrors that we are forced to witness every day in Palestine. It's also different from those kinds of institutions because the tribunal doesn't think that we have to wait until there's a final pronouncement made by some international court years down the road in the face of a historic exigency like genocide, right? We think that passive deference to official institutions that are clearly not doing their jobs is morally indefensible. So unlike these courts and official institutions, the tribunal begins with the recognition of the reality of genocide, the reality of apartheid, the reality of settler colonialism, which it sees as undeniable realities. These crimes have already for a long time been confirmed by prominent human rights organizations, UN bodies, genocide scholars. By now, they're beyond reasonable doubt, we think. Right? Everybody calls this the first live-streamed genocide. We don't have to guess whether that's happening.
I kind of want to ask you about that. Last time you were on, we had a sort of a back and forth about the limitations of international law and what it means to be looking at a live stream genocide where the accountability doesn't seem to follow from the awareness. And a lot of political context that we talk about on this show and as the broader left, it's often framed as, these awareness campaigns and these persuasion campaigns. Well, if we can just get enough people to support Medicare for all, or, oppose genocide, or whatever it is, that democracy will prevail. And it has, I hope, become very clear to everyone, if not just from those two examples and from myriad others, that we don't live in a democracy. There is very little to no relationship between what people want and what our leadership is willing to do. And that is a kind of shock to the system. It could have a paralyzing, demotivating effect, or it can have people decide to prioritize levers of action outside of a more typical political electoral context. And I do wonder what you hope to get out of the Sarajevo Declaration and the Gaza Tribunal, generally speaking, given that, to your point, there are all these international legal bodies, the ICC, the ICJ, that have weighed in on this and are continuing to weigh in on this, and at least in a preliminary way have said this is a plausible genocide. I see the value in getting legal scholars on the record to provide the rest of us with language to confidently be able to talk about the Palestinian right to return, the right to resist as an occupied people, things that if you said it in the weeks and months immediately after October 7th, 2023, would get you, deplatformed as a terrorist apologist, and, oh, you're calling for violence. Well, yeah, there is a legal right to these things. And I remember feeling very empowered by legal scholars who provided that language, again, in the days and weeks after October 7th. But how are you feeling now, I wonder, about what the task ahead is to actually bringing the genocide to a close?
Well, we are up against extremely powerful forces. You are right that there are no democratic institutions to which we can turn for justice. Our governments, the US government first and foremost, and many governments in the West, are captured and corrupted on behalf of interests that have nothing to do with human rights, that find human rights inconvenient, that don't give a damn about the suffering of the Palestinian people or any other people around the world. They're making determinations based largely on pay for play. And I don't have $100 million like Miriam Adelson to buy U.S. foreign policy from Donald Trump or from Joe Biden or for anybody else who has been complicit in these crimes over so many decades. But what we do have is we have society. We have a growing consciousness among people that something very wrong is happening, and that our own governments and our own institutions, right down to universities, are complicit in the horrors that are being perpetrated, and that maybe it's time for people to take action. And it's interesting, at this very moment, we've got a People's Tribunal going on. We've got a People's March to Gaza being organized. We've got a People's Freedom Flotilla sailing with humanitarian aid toward Gaza's shore. The zeitgeist of the day, the center of it, is a recognition by people of conscience that we are living in the belly of the beast, that our own governments are captured and corrupted, that international institutions are bowed and unable or unwilling to respond with whatever power that they have, but that people collectively do have a certain power, a power that made a difference in the civil rights movement in the United States, even when the government, Democrat and Republican, and all institutions were aligned against it. A power that helped to end the so-called Vietnam War, U.S. aggression and atrocities in Vietnam, because people rose up and made it untenable to continue the way had it gone. A power that helped to end apartheid in South Africa, even though the government of the United States, for example, was supporting the apartheid regime straight up through the 1980s and still had Nelson Mandela registered as a terrorist until, years after he had been freed, and even after he had come to visit the United States. So there is power in conscience. There is power in society if it can be mobilized. And, if it were only our governments that were aligned against us, the task would be much easier. But we've got media corporations that are all in support of the genocide and in the slandering of those who oppose the genocide. You've got tech companies and energy companies and weapons manufacturers that are all in for the genocide because it makes money for them and because they are ideologically aligned with the Israeli colonial project in Palestine. There are a lot of, you've got Israel proxy groups that are ruthless and constantly harassing people, and sometimes worse, for daring to speak up against this. And in spite of all of that, the movement to free Palestine has been growing by leaps and bounds over a period of 19 months at a rate that we've never seen in history. And even at the risk of arrest, the risk of being beaten, the risk of being expelled from school, fired from your job, those numbers are growing. All the predictions about the movement dying when people came back to school in the fall and with all of the repression that was coming from the federal government, those did not come true. The movement has not died; it's continued to grow, and that power can be tapped into to make this the continuation of these horrors untenable. And frankly, to liberate Palestine, we have to liberate the United States as well from this capture and corruption, and that's what people can do.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the student movements. There have been a number of really exceptional statements at universities over the course of this graduation season from valedictorians and others who've been given opportunities to speak. The young woman at MIT's speech has gotten, rightly so, a lot of circulation.
You have faced the obstacle of fear before, and you turned it into fuel to stand up for what is right. You showed the world that MIT wants a free Palestine. Last spring, MIT's undergraduate body and graduate student union voted overwhelmingly to cut ties with the genocidal Israeli military. You called for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And you stood in solidarity with the pro-Palestine activists on campus. You faced threats, intimidation, and suppression coming from all directions, especially your own university officials. But you prevailed because the MIT community that I know would never tolerate a genocide. Right now, while we prepare to graduate and move forward with our lives, there are no universities left in Gaza. We are watching Israel try to wipe Palestine off the face of the earth, and it is a shame that MIT is a part of it. The Israeli occupation forces are the only foreign military that MIT has research ties with. This means that Israel's assault on the Palestinian people is not only aided and abetted by our country, but our school. As scientists, engineers, academics, and leaders, we have a commitment to support life, support aid efforts, and call for an arms embargo, and keep demanding now, as alumni, that MIT cuts the ties. Now, I invite you all to join me in the tradition of turning the ring. Please raise your brass rat or grad rat bearing hands, and as you lift it off your fingers, notice that the beaver is no longer facing you. It is now facing the world. This is a world that we will be entering with an immeasurable responsibility. We will carry with us the stamp of the MIT name, the same name that is directly complicit in the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. And so we carry with us the obligation to do everything we can to stop it. Class of 2025, you are MIT. Pressure is nothing to you. I know you will take it head on, and I can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you, and congratulations again.
There was also a gentleman at Morehouse University who gave an incredibly compelling speech as well. We'd love to clip both of those in there for the audience to hear portions of.
And I know some of y'all don't agree like me. It's all right when you preach your sermon, preach it the way you want to preach it, but today I'm going to preach mine the way God told me to preach it. Yeah. When the United States continues to send billions of dollars to fund weapons to Israel, it'll make you hold your head down. When almost 35,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, while 1,200 people have been killed in Israel, it'll make you hold your head down. When institutions who taught us to be socially conscious turn and ask for us to become conveniently silent, it'll make you hold your head down. When just this past week, a fourth grader dies by suicide because of bullying, revealing our nation is in the midst of a mental health crisis. And prayers and church alone will not heal every mental illness. We need Christ and a couch, theology and therapy, meditation and medication. It'll make you hold your head down. When we see peaceful protesters attacked and carried away like animals, all while some others with the complexion for the protection are taken by Burger King after murdering 9 people in Bible study in Charleston, South Carolina, it'll make you hold your head down. On the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education this weekend, schools in black and brown communities received $23 billion less than schools in white neighborhoods. It'll make you hold your head down.
It feels in some ways like a flip has switched. And I wonder if you've observed this as well, where in the same way that after Joe Biden's final debate, there seemed to be permission given to observe his cognitive frailties, there has been a sort of shift in an ability to acknowledge that Israel is behaving poorly. Most virally in the last week or so, spokesperson Matt Miller, who spent the last several years of the Biden administration smirking from behind the podium as he denied what we were seeing in this live stream, genocide, with our own lying eyes, has come out saying that, of course, he believes that the administration is committing war crimes, that Israel is committing war crimes, that, of course, that America is complicit, but that he was unable to say this from the podium because it was not his responsibility to say his own personal opinion, but the conclusions of the U.S. government, which had not concluded that Israel was committing war crimes. I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Do you think what's going on in Gaza now is a genocide?
I don't think it's a genocide, but I think I think it is without a doubt true that Israel has committed war crimes.
You wouldn't have said that at the podium.
Yeah, look, because when you're at the podium, you're not expressing your personal opinion. You're expressing the conclusions of the United States government. The United States government had not concluded that they've committed war crimes, still have not concluded that.
But your personal view is they have. And they were while you were there.
But let me qualify that. There are two ways to think about the commission of war crimes. One is if the state has pursued a policy to deliberately committing war crimes or is acting reckless in a way that aids and abets war crimes, if the state is committing war crimes, and that I think is an open question. I think what is almost certainly not an open question is that there have been individual incidents that have been war crimes where Israeli soldiers, members of the Israeli military, have committed war crimes. And we do know that Israel has opened investigations, but look, we are many months into those investigations and we're not seeing Israeli soldiers held accountable. So ultimately, in almost every major conflict, including conflicts prosecuted by democracies, you will see individual members of the militaries commit war crimes. And the way you judge a democracy is whether they hold those people accountable.
But Israel hasn't.
That's my point,
right.
Is we have not yet seen them hold sufficient numbers of the military accountable. And I think it's an open question whether they're going to.
What do you make of that?
Oh, so much to make of so little. I mean, first of all, who cares whether Matt Miller thinks it's genocide, as if it's an editorial opinion? He says, I wasn't supposed to give my opinion when I was doing my job. Well, your opinion is irrelevant. Anyone's opinion is irrelevant. Genocide is a crime with specific elements. Those elements have been met, and the fact that genocide is being perpetrated has been affirmed by every major international human rights organizations, genocide scholars, plausibly by the International Court of Justice and so on. So Matt Miller having a feeling that it's not genocide really isn't relevant. And what it tells me is that, the focus on this clip that's been playing a lot lately is that Matt Miller confessed that he knew that Israel was perpetrating war crimes and he lied about it when he was on the podium, which is already horrible enough because it says, I was just talking to on another show about these mercenaries that have been deployed to Gaza, working with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and so on. Matt Miller is confessing to having been a mercenary. He's saying, I knew that what I was saying was not true, but I said it because it was my job. I got paid to lie to the American people. And by the way, he didn't only deny the atrocities that were being perpetrated, he actively disseminated Israeli propaganda for genocide over and over again from that podium. Lies, fabricated stories, justifications for attacks on hospitals and so on. He participated very close to what's known as incitement in international law, but participated in covering up those atrocities and justifying those crimes as they were perpetrated. Now he says, no, I don't think my opinion is it's not genocide. And there may be some war crimes, but they're not intentional. And if some Israeli soldiers are doing things wrong, the government needs to tell them to stop. That's hardly a huge moral step forward from the position that he was taking before. He's still a genocide denier. He's still denying that this is a systematic campaign against the Palestinian people, which is, at this stage is really undeniable. He's still lying. And so both sides of that moral coin, I think, are really disgusting.
Yeah, I'm glad you commented on that piece because I was wondering about this distinction that he keeps making between there being these one-off rogue actions by individual Israeli troops versus a sort of organizational, intentional, planned violation of international law by the Israeli military. It's an odd inverse of the claim that was made about October 7th, wherein the propaganda was that there were not just individual rapes, which were also not proven, but a mass planned campaign of rapes that were intended to sort of speak to the character of not just individual members of Hamas, but the Palestinian people in a way that was to justify their annihilation. And here, a sort of reverse trick seems to be pulled by Miller, that even if I were to admit that war crimes happened, it was individual choices that cannot be attached accountability-wise to the Israeli government. Legally speaking, what do you make of that argument?
Well, again, Matt Miller is lying. Matt Miller is not somebody who's a farmer and he's in his fields all day and doesn't have time to try to get information on what's happening on the ground. He knows perfectly well from his privileged, life amongst policymakers in the U.S. government and he knows what the International Court of Justice knows. He knows what the International Criminal Court knows. He knows what Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the United Nations and the special rapporteurs and the Gaza Tribunal for which I work. He knows what we know, which is that all the evidence points to the systematic annihilation of Palestinian people moving from north to south in the Gaza Strip, perpetrating what Benjamin Netanyahu calls Amalek, and what scholars have called omnicide, which is to say the intentional destruction of everybody and everything, right? That's what the evidence points to. And we also know that because of the impunity provided by the US government, the UK government, people like Matt Miller, that what is unique about this genocide is it's the first time in history that you see the leaders of the country repeatedly declaring publicly and out loud their genocidal intent on the record, because they're so confident in their own impunity, paid for by our tax dollars, that they will never be held to account, that they can feed the worst instincts of their followers when speaking in Hebrew. So, you cannot explain tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of dead, most of them civilians, the destruction of hospital after hospital, shelter after shelter, school after school, food store after food store, the assassination of humanitarian workers and UNRWA workers and journalists and medical professionals, food, water, everything that is necessary to sustain life. And then the bulldozing into a moonscape of any remnants of that so that nobody can return home, and then say, maybe some soldiers perpetrated unintentional war crimes about which the Israeli regime is not aware and should not be held responsible. Matt Miller is continuing to play the despicable role that he played while he was in office by covering up the reality of what's happening on the ground. And he's no different in that sense from other people that are a part of or were a part of the entire, greater U.S. government policy structure, those who are in office, those who are in the think tanks, those who are circulating back in and out. That's the common wisdoms, right? While official institutions are debating whether the night is falling, the people in Palestine know the darkness is already here. And we know it, everyone who is watching at all. And we have a moral imperative to confront these crimes now with all the power that we have, not to wait for this kind of nonsense debate that is going on in the corridors of power in Washington and in London and elsewhere. And we, in the Tribunal, we don't do this moral prevarication stuff that's so common with people like, even in the UN, let alone in governments like the US. We explicitly reject the both sides approach to a situation like Palestine, where the two sides are colonizer and colonized, oppressor and oppressed. That's not a format that makes any sense, and yet they try to keep that alive, right?
Yeah, I mean, even so much for debate. What do you have? A former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. He went last Sunday, condemned the quote thugs in the government of current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, doubling down on his accusation that they are committing quote war crimes against Palestinians in Gaza. At a certain point, you're an anti-Semite if you say Israel's committing war crimes argument does seem to go out the window when you have a former prime minister acknowledging as much.
And particularly in the last few days was the statements made by Israeli cabinet ministers, the leading cabinet ministers, that say we should starve Gaza. What is it if not a war crime? I mean, how can a serious person representing the Israeli government can spell it out in such an explicit manner that we should starve Gaza, that there should be no supply of basic fundamental humanitarian needs to a couple of millions of people living there. They are terrorists that we need to fight, but this is not a war against Hamas. This looks more and more like a political war of the Israeli Prime Minister and the cabinet and the group of thugs which are now representing the Israeli government inside Israel and across the world are committing actions which can't be interpreted in any other way.
But you mentioned a moment ago the role of the press also plays in this. So not just people like Miller who are spokespeople for the government. To be clear, the Biden administration, it's worth repeating, I think, often that most of this war was still litigated while Joe Biden was president, giving his full support of Israel's actions, even more so than Donald Trump has. Really, shallow, I wouldn't even call it praise, but, a shallow acknowledgement to Donald Trump that he has been reportedly more willing to stand up to Netanyahu than Joe Biden has done, and has secured a temporary ceasefire, which, again, small potatoes, but more than what Joe Biden was willing to do. That being said, I wanted to play this clip from CNN, which kind of shocked me. The host is Abby Phillips. I don't consider her to be one of the worst out there, but the tenor and tone of this discussion and the sort of concessions rhetorically that were made right off the bat by Abby, I found to be particularly galling. I wanted to get your reaction.
There are specific things that are being said on these campuses that are anti-Semitic. But the idea that AOC and, I don't know, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar are engaging in those activities, I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence.
They spoke at the campuses.
You know what I mean?
They were there on those campuses.
Right, but I guess. But here's what I'm saying.
Right.
But do you understand what I'm saying? If they show up on college campuses to protest, what's the situation in Gaza, are you saying automatically the same thing as uttering anti-Semitic words?
Yes, they're anti-Semitic. Make no mistake about it. Their words are absolutely, and this is all based in anti-Semitism.
Right, what I'm saying is, do you have evidence that they actually engaged in anti-Semitic language? That is the issue.
Supporting terrorists and some of her past. Are you saying? I mean, do we have to go through the statements?
I am talking about on college campuses. Because I think that there is a difference between protesting.
Is very clear.
There's a history. There's a difference between protesting and saying and doing anti-Semitic things. Would you not agree?
Ilhan Omar's rhetoric, as it pertains to Jewish people in the state of Israel, is deplorable and disgusting. She shouldn't even be in Congress, in my opinion. And them showing up on those college campuses is a green light for the most vicious, disgusting, despicable rhetoric against Jewish students and against Jewish people. You can absolutely draw a correlation. And to pretend that they were on the college campuses and saying kumbaya is to just be naive.
Okay, so listeners might be surprised to hear that was CNN, an ostensibly liberal channel, and the voices that you heard were Congressman Chris Sununu, and then at the end there, another conservative, Michael Singleton. Craig, I saw this one this morning, and I had to throw it in because I feel like I'm losing my mind. At the same time that it does seem like the Overton window is shifting to a generalized acknowledgement of Israel committing war crimes, doing a genocide, there does seem to be a harsh, doubling down, an escalation on the part of people who would defend Israel, especially targeting campus activists.
I don't even know what to say anymore when I see things like that. One of the hardest things for me in leaving the UN and paying more attention to what's happening in the US is looking at the Congress of the United States and seeing what a clown show it really is. Every single utterance in that clip was a lie.
Yeah.
There was not that, and a smear. I mean, slander seems to be, the bread and butter of American politicians these days. The idea that courageous and principled students with a lot to lose and very little to gain, strictly because they have a conscience, assembling on campus to protest against a live-streamed genocide. The idea that they are the bad guys and those defending a genocidal apartheid regime, the perpetration of crimes against babies, are the good guys is the most outrageous thing that I can possibly imagine. And if your tendencies are so fascistic, so cold-blooded, if that really is the way that you see the world, you should be hiding in a barn somewhere, not going on television to show the whole world that you think that criticizing a regime perpetrating genocide is the wrong thing to do, and slandering brave people who have the courage to do so. And by the way, this trick does not work anymore outside of CNN. Everyone has been called an anti-Semite and a supporter of terrorism. Every decent human being on the planet who has dared to utter a criticism of the Israeli regime, according to these people, is an anti-Semite and a supporter of terrorism. At this stage, if they have not called you an anti-Semite and or a supporter of terrorism, you're probably a very bad person or you're dead, right? So it doesn't work anymore. Amen. Nobody is falling for that nonsense anymore. And they're never, CNN, I've got a lot of things I can say about them, but that is not journalism. Allowing people to make outrageous claims, slandering individuals and groups, and not challenge them to give any evidence of what was the anti-Semitic thing that was said or was done, which they cannot do. Right. Well, they said that Israel shouldn't commit genocide. Whoa, yeah, that's very anti-Semitic, Right. So that is the level of, this brings us back to the beginning of our conversation. We are not going to get justice by appealing to people like that. They are bought, they are paid for. We don't have the capital that it would take to purchase those mercenaries. And Miriam Edelson does, and AIPAC does, and they're earning their keep, I think, very very well. In the meantime, American society is moving on, and the rest of the world is moving on.
Yeah, it's worth noting that Ro Khanna was also on that panel. I'm sure he spoke before or after that clip, but it does, I think, clips like that do raise the question of what CNN's agenda is, what their goals are. I think elsewhere it's been pointing out that there is an incredible irony of Jake Tapper spending so much time on his own show on CNN advocating for his book, which talks about the cover-up of Biden's cognitive capacity.
We're back with breaking news in our politics lead and a brand new excerpt from my upcoming book with Axios' Alex Thompson. It's called Original Sin. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's on Biden's decline. It's called Original Sin. I'm sure you've heard on May 20th. That's Tuesday. Original Sin. That's coming out in 3 weeks. On May 20th. That's just 19 days away. In 1 week and 1 day. Coming out in just a few days. Comes out Tuesday. You will not believe what we found out.
Don't news people have to tell you what they know when they find it out? Isn't that the difference between news and a secret?
At the same time that he was a peddler of that cognitive capacity, and also at the same time that he continues to peddle lies about Israel to justify its continued genocide.
It has to do with an academic theology of oppressor and oppressed.
Yes.
If you only look at the world as oppressor versus oppressed, you then have to choose in a conflict, this group is the oppressor, this group is the oppressed. It's also why, for example, there have been conflicts on other college campuses where gay students have protested things that are going on in Muslim countries having to do with the LGBTQ community in those countries. And the gay students are made to be the oppressor because a lot of them are white. And that's also what's going on when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israelis are made to be the oppressor, the Palestinians the oppressed, and on and on and on. And that's part of what's going on at Harvard, that theology, that way of looking at the world.
So you noted, Craig, that America's politics are a cluster F, as they say. My words, not yours.
I said cloud show, but that works even better.
Cloud show, okay. Much more polite than mine. I want to ask you about the UN. As someone who worked for the UN for so long and who resigned in the days after October 7th in 2023, it was just announced that Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, is set to become the new president of the UN General Assembly for a year. This has caused people to raise quotes that reflect what her politics on this issue are. One statement from last fall was, quote, "I made it clear to the United Nations that civilian places can also lose their protected status because terrorists abuse it. That's what Germany stands for," reflecting a censorious environment that has inflicted Germany, so many European countries, and of course the United States of America. What do you make of UN leadership? And do you have any optimism about UN reform now that there are these threats to UN funding coming from Donald Trump?
Yeah. Annalena Baerbock being elected as the president of the General Assembly is an outrage. She is well known as somebody who throughout this genocide has, without fail, defended the Israeli regime and the perpetration of every horrendous act that it has perpetrated. She has, from her official podium, justified the killing of children, the attacking of hospitals. I mean, she is really an extremist. And German government policy is it's like U.S. government policy toward Israel. The Germans, they just don't seem to be able to get enough. The ruling class of genocide, they perpetrated it against the peoples of Namibia and then against Jews and others in Europe, and now are fully complicit in the genocide in Palestine, and they do it without blushing. And Annalena Baerbock has been one of the foremost faces of that horrific policy. She has been wholly complicit in the perpetration of the genocide. Why was she elected president of the General Assembly? I think couple of reasons. One is that I think I've spoken before on this show about WEOG, the Western Europe and Other Group, which is one of the regional groupings in the UN. All the other political groupings in the UN are actually regional: Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. Only one regional grouping is not regional. It's the WEOG, which stands for the Western Europe and Other Group, which I have nicknamed the Colonial Bloc or the White Group, because it includes Western Europe, but it also includes the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel. And so that is to say Western Europe and European settler colonial states. It used to include South Africa under apartheid. But when South Africa ceased to be under apartheid and ceased to be a member of the White Bloc, as it were, they left. And what happens for the election of president of the GA is that it rotates among the so-called regional groups. So Africa gets a turn, and then Asia gets a turn, and Latin America gets a turn. And this was WEOG's turn. And with all of the billions of people, or millions, how many people are in the Western Europe group? They decided to wash the resume of this genocidaire by putting her forward. Now, the tradition in the UN is that the regional group gets to pick, and it's usually not challenged. The others just go along with it in a ceremony. In this case, there was some hope because it was such an outrageous choice that the rest of the world would say no. But backdoor dealing has led to this horrific assault. And it means that while the UN is going to be called upon to answer to the genocide that's happening, while it's going to be called again to follow up on the resolution of the General Assembly that's going to expire toward the end of the year, for Israel to end its occupation, to implement the decisions of the World Court, and so on, she will be presiding over those meetings. It means that in June, when the International Conference on Palestine takes place at the UN, she will be the president of the General Assembly. It is an absolute outrage. And I have said, just in the months of this genocide, 3 things have happened to the UN that are going to undercut its sustainability. One is the funding cut from the United States. 2 is the inaction or the inadequate action of the UN during a live stream genocide, undercutting its credibility. And 3 now was the election of Annalena Baerbock as the president of the UN General Assembly. And if you look at all 3 of those factors, they all go back to Israel. The US, the centerpiece of its policy at the United Nations and its punishment of the United Nations is that parts of the UN have dared to criticize Israel. Baerbock rose to prominence because she was the main defender on the European continent of Israel and has supported the genocide, and the silence on the genocide itself also traces back to Israel. If the UN doesn't survive these 3 very serious blows, 2 of them you could say, one of them you could say was external, which is to say the funding cuts, but the other 2 are self-inflicted because they're questions of not standing up for principle in the way that the organization was supposed to do under its 1945 charter. And it's a dangerous moment. Whether or not they will survive this or come out of it in a credible way is an open question.
Yeah, I don't want to skip over this. Basically what you're saying is there are regional groups among which power is shared to ostensibly give every part of the globe equal say, but they've stacked the deck to give basically colonial power / Europe another bite of the apple by creating an extra quote unquote regional group that's not regional at all, but that just has all of the colonial powers in it.
Not only that, but it is a disproportionately powerful group. So, for example, they hold more of the senior posts in the United Nations, the political appointees. They've had more secretaries general than their share. They have more heads of agencies and departments than their share. They have a disproportionate allocation for seats in intergovernmental bodies because they refuse to address the formula. They have more members on the Security Council than any other regional group because they've got the US and France and the UK. 3 out of the P5 of the 5 permanent members are in WEOG, and all 3 of them have vetoes. So this disproportionate power of this one Western colonial bloc is what distorts so much in the UN. I did a piece on this in Foreign Policy in Focus last year, and gotten a lot of feedback on it because it's like the worst kept secret at the UN. How can it be that every other group is in fact a region, but this one is allowed not to be a regional group, but is a I don't know what it is. I call it
It's incredibly bold, is what it is. I mean, it's so flagrant. I'm struggling to even wrap my head around it. So look, that's just one of the three blows that the UN is facing right now. I mean, the funding one is potentially a huge one. Can you give us a sense of what kinds of cuts are being proposed, what that would do to the UN budget and its ability to, continue its mission? And also, this is the question that I have, and I think this came up a little bit last time you were on the show. To the extent that the U.S. is able to be the tail wagging the dog of the United Nations because of its outsized financial support, in part, would that financial support going away make it so that it was basically a sunk cost for the UN to do its job and sanction Israel and sanction America and go ahead and get on its bad side? Is there a potential upside here to the extent that the UN can still operate without, with a dramatically reduced budget, that it might finally have independence?
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. It's what I've been arguing with my former colleagues as well. You can imagine there's a lot of fear inside the UN because so basically what has happened is that over time, the regular budget of the UN, which is assessed contributions that everybody has to pay their dues and so on, which creates something of a firewall, right? You pay and then the money is distributed across programs and so on. That has not kept pace with the needs of the UN and the situation in the world and so on. And so increasingly over the years, the UN began to rely more and more on what's called voluntary contributions, where individual donor countries will provide funds to keep these programs and agencies going because their regular budget allocation is minuscule compared to what the needs are. I mean, humanitarian needs, human rights needs, peacekeeping, all those sorts of things. And while that has been a good thing in the sense that it's allowed the UN to do its job more often than it otherwise would have been able to, it has created some distortions in the UN because, for example, some agencies rely for 60% of their funding on the United States. And the United States is not the kind of superpower that plays fair. The United States wants something back for everything that it gives. So your question is a good one because I believe that while this is a genuine crisis, and maybe thousands or hundreds of people will lose their job in any event in the UN, people doing valuable work. People will go hungry. People will not get the medical care they would otherwise get. People will not get the human rights protection they would otherwise get. They will not get you will not have the diplomatic conferences that you would otherwise need to resolve conflict. You will not get the peacekeeping forces that you need where there is an opportunity to separate forces. All of those things are in genuine jeopardy, not just the jobs of UN personnel, but people who depend on the UN. Outside of the United States, Israel and Taliban areas of Afghanistan, most people in the world like the UN and they want the UN to be there helping them. And so that's a real loss. However, every crisis also provides an opportunity. And if there were vision and courage at the helm of the UN, my view is they could use this to start to separate themselves from disproportionate domination by the United States in particular and some other powers to allow them to do their job in a more principled and consistent way. I have seen no evidence that the proposals for so-called reform in the UN are going in that direction. Instead, it's this effort to try to satisfy the US and other donors that we're going to cut costs and we're going to shrink and so on and so forth, without any of those fundamental adjustments. It's an opportunity, for example, for other states to step up. So if you're an agency and you're taking 60% from the Americans, you've already lost the game. How about getting more money from universal donorship, even if it's only a few $1,000s from some countries, poor countries? How about getting China more involved, the BRICS countries more involved, and so on? There is an opportunity to rebalance the funding environment in a way that would allow agencies and programs to do their job in a more principled way, more consistent with their charter, and with their mandates. I don't know if they will do it. I remain hopeful that at least some of them will try to do it. but the jury is still out on. I haven't seen any really bold proposals to rebalance, and I haven't seen any other states and groups of states stepping up in the way that they would have to. We saw it with UNRWA, right? It was defunded by the U.S. and some of its vassals. That should have been a moment when the rest of the world really stepped up. Some of them did, but not at scale of what was needed when the U.S. defunded UNRWA. No country should have a veto over human rights or humanitarian aid or peacekeeping, and yet sadly they do.
You mentioned the idea of BRICS countries, of China becoming more involved, upping their funding, basically. Is there, my understanding was that it was sort of proportional based on GDP or what have you. Have there been discussions about suggestions that, has China articulated a desire to contribute more or desire to not contribute more? I mean, what does that even look like to say? I guess what I'm asking is, has there been a desire to maintain the power, the kind of pro-Western power in the United Nations by choosing a funding strategy that disempowers China's contribution despite it being such an enormous economy?
Well, China has been increasing its contributions to the UN steadily over time in recent years as its economy has grown, including its extra budgetary funding, its voluntary funding, as it was called, and other countries have as well. And with that, China's influence has grown in the United Nations. It's still not at the point. You still have a sense of programs that are wholly dominated by the European Union and the United States and WEOG, basically, and that's problematic. But in the immediate term, it would be possible for other states, a coalition of states, the G77, for example, which is the majority of states, or the G77 in China, which is one of the ways that they meet, to increase their voluntary contributions in such a way that the agencies would be saved, their work would be saved, and the influence, I think the very malign influence of the United States government would be reduced. And we could talk about why I think its influence is malign in the U.S. in the UN for the most part. That would be a short-term solution. Long-term reform should be to create a UN which is less reliant on voluntary contributions, so that the actual assessed contributions in the regular budget, where states are given assessments that they have to pay their dues, as they are sometimes called, that those things actually meet most of the needs of the organization. So it didn't rely so much on, okay, we'll take money from the US, and maybe US, if you give us money, we won't, we won't push the anti-racism program that you don't like, which, by the way, they don't like, or we won't push economic and social rights because we know you don't like economic and social rights, right?
Wait a minute. Even in a pre-Trump world, the United States is known for being against anti-racism programs and kind of economic justice programs.
Yeah, the U.S. has been the tip of the spear since the UN adopted its global program called the Durban Agenda to combat racism around the world, with some other colonial countries, notably Israel, but some others as well. It is on the record every year as opposing economic and social rights as rights. So the whole UN Human Rights Program is based upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as its cornerstone. Civil and political rights, like, freedom of speech and opinion and assembly and voting rights and fair trial and no torture and, no arbitrary detention and so on. And economic and social rights like health and education and housing and water and sanitation, all those sort of things. And in spite of that, the U.S. is on record year after year as saying these are not rights. The U.S. is alone in the Western industrialized world and saying that things like education and healthcare and water and sanitation are not rights. They're commodities for sale to those who can afford them, as you and I have discussed before.
Love that.
And so it opposes the UN programs in those areas. It opposes spending in those areas. It opposes promotional activities in those areas. Ironically, what it used to say all the time was you should spend more time on free speech and less time on the right to health. Well, now it doesn't believe in free speech. It doesn't pretend to believe in free speech anymore, as it's persecuting people simply for defending human rights in Palestine. So I don't know what their claim is in human rights anymore, but they were never supporters of that. In fact, the U.S. has systematically opposed most of the international human rights agenda, Democrat or Republican, year after year. It opposes as I said, the agenda on anti-racism. It opposes child rights. It's the only country in the world, as you know, that has not ratified the treaty that protects children's rights at the UN. It opposes the International Criminal Court. It opposes economic and social rights. It opposes the right to development. It opposes, could I say capital punishment? The agenda on capital punishment. Many things. It opposes most of the international human rights agenda. And when I say opposes, it's not just like one of those countries that just votes no. It uses its significant diplomatic and economic and political power to push the agenda away from those areas that are priorities for the rest of the world.
I know that we talked about this last time you were on, but I had to get it out on the record again because I find it to be just so galling and overwhelming. I don't know if you saw that tweet over the last few days that went something like, was it Charlie Kirk, I think? He tweeted something like, Islam is incompatible with Western democracy or Western civilization or something. And I read it as just a huge self-own of Western civilization because this is what it is. Right. It's Western civilization to America, right? America opposing the Universal Declaration for the Rights of the Child because it doesn't want to force insurance companies out of the marketplace so that it can actually give people healthcare as a human right. As we wrap, you've alluded a couple of times to this mercenary aid distribution mess. A better M word is probably massacre. That evolved over the last couple of days as we're recording with this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, noted also as GHF, this mercenary group that was relatively recently founded in Switzerland, who was deployed to Gaza to administer food ostensibly in the wake of UNRWA's, defunding. This is the scenario where we got these viral images of Palestinians being lined up in these sort of troughs that are very reminiscent of imagery from the Nazi Holocaust. And almost before it got started, the effort was a disaster with the CEO quitting before any aid was distributed, saying that he had concerns that there would be criminal investigation for possible criminal misconduct in the administration of this aid. There was an admission that what they were doing could be construed as concentration camps. And of course, the apotheosis of this was murder, shootings of Palestinians, which Israeli authorities have denied despite there being video evidence, and doctors from a nearby hospital testifying to the injured, including women and children that came in large numbers around the time this was supposed to have happened. I've sort of glossed and summarized it, but I want to give you an opportunity to sort of tell us what actually happened here.
Well, this was never a humanitarian aid plan. And I'm very frustrated by the fact that even after all these developments, the media continues to refer to it as such. This is a hodgepodge of Israeli and U.S. intelligence operatives, sketchy finance firms, mercenaries, and private military contractors posing as humanitarians, but actually set up as a part of the Israeli regime's strategy of occupation and its final phase of the genocide in Gaza. That's what it is, and I don't think we should be shy about it. All of these shadowy things, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation registered in Delaware and Switzerland, but nobody in the humanitarian field had ever heard of it before, together with these mercenary or private military contracting firms like Safe Reach Solutions and UG Solutions, paying mercenaries, $10,000 up front and $1,100 a day to basically serve in the Israeli occupation. These are people with links to the CIA, to Blackwater, to mercenary forces that have wreaked havoc all around the globe. And every legitimate international aid group, humanitarian organization, the UN have all condemned this thing, which isn't set up for humanitarian reasons. It is set up for military reasons by Israel, but it is set up, to provide a fig leaf to tamp down Western public pressure on the Israeli regime, basically a smokescreen for genocide, because they were getting a little bit too much heat on starving people to death in Gaza. It was set up as a vehicle to get the UN out of the way, UNRWA in particular, because the UN is the main lifeline of the people in Gaza, and you cannot complete your genocide and ethnic cleansing as long as UNRWA is functioning there. So you needed to have a, no, don't look at that, look over here. And it was set up principally as a tool to drive genocide survivors southward in Gaza into a handful of, yes, concentration camps, literally so, where survivors are concentrated in horrific conditions, thus clearing the north of Gaza and getting the survivors all together for easy departure or ultimately for death. So in place of an effective UN aid distribution network that works, that is tried and true over decades, that has local relationships and networks, that gets the job done without anybody being hurt and actually gets the food to the people who need it, and that has, thousands of trucks waiting outside the checkpoints, they created this fake organization. They blocked all UN humanitarian aid and blocked UN operations there, shutting them down unlawfully. They set up 4 distribution points. So basically, these are like contractors working in the kitchen of a concentration camp, right? One south of the Netzarim corridor, which is a heavily militarized area of the occupation, and then 3 of them right up against the Egyptian border near Rafah so that people can be easily purged out. Then they told Palestinians to walk for hours, risking their lives on the way, put them in cages in the hot sun of Gaza for hours. Some of them get abducted by the Israeli military even before they get to the cages. And being abducted by that means beatings and torture and sexual assault, disappearance, and in some cases death. Others are completely turned away after making the trek because there's not enough food and they don't want to give it to everybody anyway. A lot of them are too weak, too far away, too sick, pregnant, taking care of children, disabled. They can't even make the trip if they wanted to. And as we know now, on 3 occasions already in the short life of this thing, many of them have also been shot down by Israeli quadcopters and tanks and snipers. More than 100 people have already been killed at these GHF aid traps. Hundreds more have been wounded. Many more have been abducted by occupation forces. And even, Brianna, if you succeed, what you get, the few people who get anything, is a meager package of food, well below nutritional requirements, and mostly dry goods with no clean water or fuel with which to cook it, no baby formula. So the most vulnerable of all the victims of the starvation there, the babies, aren't getting anything out of this and will be left to die. And in the meantime, Israel is systematically destroying homes and tents and refugee shelters to prevent people from returning. So they have no place to go except to these concentration camps. That is not aid. That is a cruel component of genocide.
Yeah, I think many of us have seen the image of that, the skeletal baby, to your point about not having any formula available. And yeah, this is what my mother was, sorry, Mom. This is what my mother was saying, that, the UN is good at distributing these food programs, and they know how to provide, like nutritionally appropriate, kind of culturally appropriate, easy to cook or prepare, or doesn't require preparation rather in these kind of dire conditions. And the kind of hubris of these rando mercenaries thinking they can hand out, rice when there's not clean water or water at all to boil and prepare. And these kind of like random foodstuffs that also don't provide the sort of nutritional profile that's necessary for complete nutrition. It's just galling. I mean, she's been doing this for a while, but Cindy McCain calling out the administration for its complicity in this.
Is there anything you can add about this incident this morning? Hamas claiming 31 people killed. You just saw the GHF denying that anything happened. Do you have any independent information?
Well, our people are reporting the same thing on the ground. It's a tragedy, and what we need right now is an immediate ceasefire, complete unfettered access, along with the safe fence roads, every gate open to feed people and stop this catastrophe from happening. If we don't do that, it's going to be a humanitarian catastrophe, as I said, like none other.
So just to be clear, you're saying your people believe that the incident did in fact happen and that individuals were killed this morning?
Yes, we do.
You're calling for a ceasefire right now. Steve Witkoff said there's been a step back. How important is that right now? And what more can be done to implement that ceasefire?
Well, the previous ceasefire proved that we could do the job. We were getting in over 600 trucks a day during the ceasefire into Gaza. So people were not, they didn't have the feel of desperation. They knew food was coming. They knew they had access to food right now. And now we don't. I mean, they don't have nearly enough access points. They don't have nearly enough food going in. And so the feel of desperation, you can see it in the video, it's very disheartening. I mean, for all of us that do this, this is what we do. We understand what it takes and we understand the complexity of it, but we also understand the grave humanitarian need that is existing now.
Have you had any coordination at all this week with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
No, I have not personally. I know that there's been some meetings that have taken place around Europe, particularly on some of the things, but we've not seen a plan. We've been a part of some of those meetings. Some of them we have not been. But again, we've seen no plan. And look, we will work with anybody to feed. This is the kind of thing that at this level of desperation, we've got to work together on trying to feed people. So it's not about not willing to work with people. We need the access. We need the Israelis to let us in so we can do our job. And we do it. We are the best at what we do, I might add. And we're the ones we can not only get in, but we can get in at scale, which is what is most important right now.
All sides seem to be aligned, right? Except for the fact that there doesn't seem to be an ability so far to create any political accountability for literally corralling people in concentration camps, starving babies, and sniping them. All, by the way, this is a part that we haven't yet raised, and I want to laud Max Blumenthal for his really in-depth reporting on all of this over at the Gray Zone. The funding for this mercenary group is Israel, is Mossad. So the idea being that, to your point, they want to get UNRWA out. UNRWA having been established basically with the establishment of Israel as sort of, compromise position for, okay, we're going to institute this organization that is going to keep Palestinians in subsistence as we give away their land to Israel, has to get out of the way. It has to be gone if you want to complete the ethnic cleansing of this land and the plan to occupy 75% of the Gaza Strip on a permanent basis. I mean, it has been the case for a while, but it feels like every time I think that things can't get more obvious and more bad, they do. The admissions come fast and furious, but the conditions don't change. I wanted to raise a tweet from Thomas Massey, again, that came out over the last week or so, in which he said, nothing can justify the number of civilian casualties, tens of thousands of women and children inflicted by Israel in Gaza in the last 2 years. We should end all U.S. military aid to Israel now. That's a Republican. And I was pleasantly surprised and kind of heartened by seeing that kind of messaging coming out of the U.S. Congress, but very quickly depressed by the fact that I don't think I've seen that kind of statement, the kind of statement that says, yes, we're going to talk in terms of power and our ability as a country to actually stop what Israel is doing instead of pretending like we need to make these kind of proclamations and statements about, that are finger wagging, like we don't approve of what's going on there, as though we don't have complete control over what's going on there. But demoralized because we haven't seen that even from our most left flank of the Democratic Party.
Demoralized but not surprised, I take it. I mean,
demoralized but not surprised.
We started talking about how much we should expect elected representatives in the United States? And the answer is not much. I mean, what's surprising is not that Thomas Massie has been consistently good on this question. It's that he's almost alone. There are very few people in the U.S. Congress who have even showed a hint of concern for humanity or international law or human rights or any of those things when it comes to the question of the destruction of the Palestinian people. And Thomas Massie is one of very few, and that's why most people have completely, there was a time when genocide was done in the dark. And then the narratives were constructed after the fact, and we were told a story. And then years later, the true story would emerge, right? Now, those of us who are not glued to corporate propaganda like CNN or Fox News, who have other sources of information like independent media, like this podcast, for example, are fully aware of what's really happening and the complicity of the people who claim to govern us. And I think that's why you are seeing initiatives coming out of society. That's why we saw the encampments. That's why we see the demonstrations in every city. That's why we have the march to Gaza that's being organized from Egypt, just of people deciding to march. And that's why we have the Freedom Flotilla, which is sailing in the Mediterranean right now toward Gaza, and that all people should be following and watching and insisting that it be protected because it's at real risk. Israel has attacked twice now.
Lindsey Graham and several others have openly joked about the idea that of the flotilla being bombed. Specifically, Greta Thunberg, tweeting that she, I hope, good luck to her. Basically, an open threat on her life.
I hope she can swim, I think is what the
right there you go.
Sick, twisted sociopath said. Please clip that piece of me calling Lindsey Graham a sick, twisted sociopath. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous, but that is your Congress. That is your Senate. That is your House of Representatives. That is your administration. Those are the people who govern the United States of America. And you are not going to find moral leadership in those bodies anytime soon. And that's, by the way, that's why the Gaza Tribunal was started, because official institutions and states weren't doing their job. So there are so many of these kinds of people's initiatives where it's the only place we can turn to for hope at this moment. And which is not to say that you should abstain from electoral politics. I'm not one of those. If you see a better candidate, do what you can, or if you're able to run. But as it is now, most of the U.S. Congress is captured and corrupted. We are unique in the world in that corruption, political corruption in the United States is legal. And it's gotten progressively more legal over the course of the last 40 years or so, to the point now where what we want as citizens, let alone non-citizens in this country, but what we want as citizens is entirely irrelevant to policymaking in Washington.
I mean, when you look to 2028, which people are doing now, and there is conversation about AOC and her sort of relative popularity with, compared to the rest of the Democratic field. I think there was a new poll for 2028 Dems that came out that set off another, speculation session in which she was relatively high. And of course, names like Pete Buttigieg get bandied about. Here, let me just read these poll results out loud. Okay, this is Gerd, hold on to your briefs. Okay. The poll released on May 30th by Atlas Intel found Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and former transportation secretary, to be the top pick among Democrats who responded to the survey. I see your head in your hands already. A total of 31.5% of self-identified Democrats who responded to the poll said they'd vote for Buttigieg in 4 years. Other surveys in May from firms such as Echelon Insights and McLaughlin Associates have found Harris in first place in the hypothetical primary. Harris is the third most popular pick among Democrats in the Atlas Intel poll, falling behind Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Among Democrats, 19.4% say they would vote for AOC, while 16.6% says they'll vote for Harris. Now, Craig, last I checked, Harris notoriously was damaged by her failure to unwillingness to break with Biden on Israel. Buttigieg, I can't say that I haven't observed him saying anything at all on Gaza. Maybe you've heard something that I haven't heard. But given that he's the consummate politician, it doesn't surprise me that he would have been mum on the subject. And as much as AOC has articulated support for Gaza, she has also been responsible for perhaps the most galling misrepresentation and betrayal of the left and carrying water for Harris and the idea that she was, quote unquote, working tirelessly for a ceasefire. And others have observed that while she tweeted in support of the victims of the attack, the domestic attack the other day, she has not tweeted anything about Palestinians since the fall of last year from her main Twitter account. Seeming retrenchment from her choice to be more vocal about Gaza prior to this season of her being considered for bigger and better things outside of Congress. So are you, hopeful when you look at this particular field for 2028? And if not, is there anybody who you'd like to see throw their hat in the ring?
You know, you and I had a brief chat on Democratic Party politics the last time that we spoke, and I haven't moved at all on that. I don't see any hope in the Democratic Party. I'm still one of those who sees the Democratic Party as a part of the problem, not a part of the solution by any means. I think it is so fundamentally corrupted and captured, as I said before. It is so in service to wealthy interests, to corporate interests, to billionaire interests, to well-financed lobbies. I think it is so in the pocket of the Israel lobby when it comes to foreign policy questions. I think that the Clinton machine and all of its excesses still has far too much influence in the structures of the Democratic Party, and I don't see, but for a very handful of people, I don't see anyone even, within the elected Congress about whom I can be enthusiastic in the Democratic Party. I've witnessed this progression in the Democratic Republicans parties over many decades, where the Republicans, the Democrats are now further right than the Republicans were when I was younger, and the Republicans are fascist. They've really just dropped all the pretense, and they've become like a Wikipedia entry for fascism. And so those are not two realistic choices as far as I'm concerned. I always vote third party, usually green, unless there's some special alternative. I have been a Democrat twice in my life. Once was to support Jesse Jackson, and the second time was to support Bernie Sanders. They both disappointed me terribly. I don't know if I'll get fooled again. So I don't know, maybe the answer is in local politics and building people up there. If I was still in New York, I would probably be voting for Mamdani. For the moment, I see some reason to be enthused about him. Maybe he'll find a way to disappoint me as well. But of course, there's a perfect case. You can bet that the Democratic Party establishment is going to use all of its power and all of its wealth and all of its connections to oppose him and to get behind even a terrible candidate like Cuomo. So no, I don't see a lot of hope there. I think the long-term vision is to build up an alternative that can challenge these two corrupt and destructive organizations. Noam Chomsky once said that the Republican Party is the most dangerous organization in the history of the world. And that's literally true when you think they have their finger on the button, they have a destructive ideology, they're militaristic, they're very dangerous, right? But if that's true, you have to say that the Democratic Party is the second most dangerous organization in the history of the world, because they're not really that far away other than rhetorically in many respects. Yeah. And for somebody who pays attention to foreign policy, I can't get excited about either one. I find them both very, very dangerous. I don't know what else to say about them, So that's not an alternative. And I'm going to put my vote behind organizing alternatives, third parties, disruption, civil disobedience, protest, public action, mobilizations of civil society and social movements, labor unions, trying to continue that a push in that direction, solidarity actions, all of those sorts of things, which are more important now than ever because of the repression in the United States. Their hope is that this wave of fear that they are putting onto civil society in the United States will tamp everybody down, and then we will be docile and manageable. This is precisely the moment to stand up and to fight back and to speak out more than ever. But it's not going to be done by Pete Buttigieg or Kamala Harris or I'm afraid AOC.
or by the way, the list goes on. Cory Booker was the fourth most popular pick. Then Gavin Newsom. You got Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer. It's a real fantastic gang. Look, Greg, I want to say I really appreciate you saying that you vote third party. People who listen to the show know that that's my choice and that I have been sort of making the case for why for years now. And it is very easy to try to sideline third-party voters as ridiculous, absurd. That's what they've done to me. That's what they've done to the Green Party, generally speaking. And if you come back with, well, why don't you invest in it if you agree with our criticisms of the Democratic Party and try to make it more plausible or more credible or get them more funding or recruit better candidates, then you get a lot of excuse making. And so when people who are perceived very credibly, especially on the left, like yourself, like Chris Hedges, talk openly about their choice to vote third party and sort of reject vote blue no matter who, I think it means a lot. I saw Chris Hedges was recently doing a live stream with Hassan Piker, who's very influential on the left and whose influence I think is really beneficial, but who is kind of an anti-third party scold. And I would love to see the two of them in dialogue about issues like that, precisely because I know how much Hassan respects Chris Hedges and I know what a powerful advocate Chris Hedges is. So that's all to say that I appreciate your voice on that issue, in addition to your obvious expertise on international law and particularly this issue of UN reform. Can you tell the audience before we wrap where they can find out and follow more about the Gaza Tribunal?
Yeah, let me just say one more thought on that because you got me riled up. The two parties, I will stop voting third party and pick one of the parties when the distinction between them is clear on what matters most. And for me, that's human rights, and it always has been. And both of them have horrendous human rights records. Both of them are neoliberal economic policy supporters, so they're both neoliberal. Both of them are neoconservative in their foreign policy, imperialist, aggressive in that way. Both of them embrace militarism, both in the policies they adopt and in the budgets that they adopt. There's no distinction between the two of them on that question. Both of them are corporatist. Both of them embrace a structure of our society that's dominated by corporations, where corporations pay less tax, have less regulation, are not held accountable, and can ruin our communities and our health and anything else they want to do. There's no distinction. Both of them are Zionist parties. Both of them have embraced a fundamentally racist and violent ideology that is colonizing Palestine, persecuting people, and by the way, is being imposed on all of us. There are 193 countries in the world. We are allowed to criticize all of them, even the US, but we're not allowed to criticize Israel. There are almost as many political ideologies in the world. We're allowed to criticize all of them, but we're not allowed to criticize Zionism. We can criticize democracy and capitalism and socialism and anything else, but not that. And both parties have contributed to that, trying to make this offensive, for many of us, ideology, an official ideology of the US Democrat and Republican. Both of them deny that healthcare is a human right. For example, both of them deny that education is a human right. So the day that there is a party, Republican or Democrat, that offers a humane vision on those issues, rather than just feeding those in power with my blood, sweat, tears, and money, and oppressing me in order to make sure they can maintain that power, then I'll vote for that party, but not before then. The Gaza Tribunal.
Wait. Now that I'm going to clip. 100% I'm going to clip that. Okay, tell me about the Gaza Tribunal.
The Gaza Tribunal you can find, you can actually, this is a very public initiative. So, for example, all of the clips that took place last week at the Gaza Tribunal are available at Gaza Tribunal/YouTube. There is a website that has things on it, including documents and so on, and a list of who all our members are, which are really some very impressive people, philosophers and public intellectuals and so on, who are associated with this. Lots of Palestinians, lots of people from around the globe, prominent people. And you can find all of those names on the website, which is GazaTribunal.com for some reason. I don't know why it's .com and not .org, but it's GazaTribunal.com. I'm writing a little piece for Mondoweiss on it. Should be out in the next couple of days. And yeah, just Google it. It's an initiative that, and I would say most of all, read, if you have time, read the Sarajevo Declaration, because it is a principled statement of what we think should be the vision for all of us in civil society working in solidarity to free Palestine from 100-year horrors that have been perpetrated on it.
Yeah, I echo that recommendation. I found some of the language to be really useful. We've talked on the show with Norm Finkelstein about this, but the use of the term sort of an ethno-supremacist movement and ethno-supremacist project, I think really cuts through a lot of the Hezbollah around Israel. I mean, it was a really powerful, really well-written, well-substantiated statement that I do think, to the extent there's still people in your lives who are sort of in this sort of, dare I say it, like a liberal Zionist space, this gives you the framework to just go the full mile and really understand that there's no sort of two-siding this, as you said before, no half-assing it was what I was going to say initially. So yeah, I really do read it, and I'll include a link to it in the description of the show notes. Thank you again, Craig, for joining us again so shortly after you were here the last time, but I really thought it was important for you to come back and talk about the updates with respect to the Gaza Tribunal and the Sarajevo statement. So thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Brianna. Always so happy to talk to you and invite me back anytime. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to all of you who have tuned in today. You know, you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday by subscribing at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. As always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.